Well, good morning again to all of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning we're going to explore a portion of Paul's letter to the congregation at Philippi. We know the letter as the book in the New Testament, Philippians. It's the 4th chapter, the first 9 verses. We're going to start by taking a look at that. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way. Dear friends, I plead with Erodia, and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companions, help these women, since they have contended at my work side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So I've entitled my message this morning, Who You Gonna Call?
Ghostbusters.
No, not this time.
There you go. That was clean. Ghostbusters.
Paul's letter this morning to the Philippians, that congregation that he dearly loved, is all about conflict resolution. Now, Paul, in this situation, doesn't charge in with flashing lights and blaring silence. Instead, he remains neutral. He enlists the help from the members of the community, and he reminds us all to find common ground in the Lord. What were his words? Stand firm in the Lord. It's the message that Paul wants us to hear, all of us to hear. It's intended to display not only in us and around us, but from us, this warmth, this friendliness that is characteristic of Paul's letter to the Philippians. He's calling his audience beloved, this longed-for sibling. Paul equates them to joy and his crown. Now, when we hear the word crown, we may think of Paul saying something like royalty. But in Paul's day and in Paul's time, that comes across to them as more of a athletic metaphor. Because in those days, the prize for winning the race was a wreath, like a crown. And that image then is a reward for striving to do their best. And they, the Philippians, found themselves that they had become Paul's prize, Paul's crown, Paul's wreath for their striving to do God's will. He named the women a name we hadn't heard before, Erodia and Syntyche. And they've just not been mentioned in the Bible before this time. And while we assume that the situation that Paul's referring to would have been known by many of the people around them, it must have been common enough for Paul not to mention the details. Who the women are, what they did, and how they came into this disagreement. was affecting the congregation of Philippi, but obviously not so severely that it was a big problem. Nonetheless, given that Paul's admonishment is gentle, it may be that the issue is not serious enough to jeopardize the congregation's well-being. Furthermore, the fact that Paul addresses them by name suggests that he still cares for these women and considers them fondly in his thoughts. And I guess you might say he's not utterly displeased with whatever is going on currently between them. So he gives generalized instructions. He suggests to the Philippian congregation how they should live. Paul has been offering specific directions to this end throughout the epistle. But here, Paul seems to sum up that entire message with just a few exhortations. Paul calls them to rejoice, fitting for the epistle, where joy is the prominent theme of all the things he talks to them about. Paul's already called the Philippians his own joy, and now he asks them to share together and with others that same joy in the way that they live and the things that they do. He encourages his audience then to let this gentleness be readily known. And the word that Paul uses here might be translated kind of like courtesy or generosity in the spirit. It may be what Paul really intended to share with them as an overall message. Paul exhorts them to take their request to God so that they might receive this peace of God. He kind of closes with that, doesn't he? And he's likely to intend to encourage that whole audience to be more gentle in the way that they live and the way they address things that are going on. Because you see, he uses this request to God so that they might receive the peace of God. And that is a true trait of the divine. So although throughout this letter to the Philippians, Paul has been concerned with what Philippians think and the mindset that they have in their daily lives. And it makes Paul draw this letter to a close with the final instructions about what they should have on their mind. So this whole image of gentleness and how we treat things that are going on and how we resolve conflicts has Paul working towards this gentle way of resolving the minor issues. I found a story that talks about a pastor named Walter Coates. He had a Presbyterian church at a little town in Pennington, New Jersey. And you see, this little church was located directly across the street from a fire station. And on occasion, there'd be a call right in the middle of worship, right in the middle of his sermon. Now, being right across the street from a fire station, they had this siren that would go off, and it was so loud that not even microphones could make his message loud enough to be heard and understood. So whenever that happened, he would just step back, he'd pause till the sirens would cease, and then he would continue. You see, the purpose of sirens came about during the days when there were no such things as cell phones and pagers. And so they had to come up with something that would call the firefighters into action. When this would happen at Walter's church, there were plenty of volunteer firefighters among his congregation. And when the siren would go off, they would jump up, the men of the church would jump up and run out the door. Walter, in retrospect, would say, I just wonder how many of them really were firefighters. In the first years of our marriage, I was a volunteer fireman in Satellite Beach, which is a little community just across the river, the Indian River from Melbourne. And they placed these, again, this was before pagers and cell phones, they would place these sirens on telephone poles at different locations throughout the community. And I tell you, they were loud. So when the siren went off, the volunteer firemen, wherever you were in earshot, you had 5 minutes to dash to the fire station before the fire truck would leave. I remember recently at a church downtown, on occasion, an anomaly would happen. You'd hear a big rig tractor trailer truck coming down the road. And you would also then hear breaker, breaker. It would bleed over from their CB radio into our sound system. And I too would have to wait until that message in that truck had gone by before I started. It always brought a big chuckle to the whole congregation. Sirens function primarily to get the attention of people around them by firefighters and law enforcement. It's a way to get through traffic when you're on a call, when there's something important. So it's also a time when you don't want to hear them because they're trying to get your attention. But not every police or fire call requires a siren. And in many jurisdictions, they go by a 3-code system. Code 1, if they say code 1, they're to respond without emergency lights, without a siren. Now code 2 is very similar, except you can use lights, but don't use the sirens. And then code 3 is all out. Siren, lights, the entire shebang. So I was thinking. I looked on the internet and I found a sound effect. A really loud sound effect. That was an example of all 3 of the different kinds of sirens. But I decided against that. Because I remember a time as a teenager when, if by chance I had an opportunity to snooze during the pastor's message, I found that very refreshing time. And I certainly wouldn't want to disturb that if that would be the case this morning. So in responding to a call, have you ever wondered what it would be like to be inside the police car? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be a fireman or a policeman and put those sirens on as you're blazing down the road and cutting through traffic? So they asked some questions. They asked some questions of, what does it feel like when you turn that siren on? And here are the responses. Depending on the siren they're using, of course, because there were many different kinds, whelps and yelps and high and low. And the officer said it was exhilarating. It brought high adrenaline. But at the same time, it made them really stressful. Because not only were they thinking of what they were going to meet up with, can you imagine what happens to the traffic in front of you when you turn on your siren? The stress grows. Sometimes they just stop in front of you. Sometimes they try to get out of the way and block the road. So it's exhilarating, but it also brings on stress. And then there's a a siren called a wail. And they said that the wail is, once it gets started, it's kind of a calming effect inside the police car. And then there is the yelp, this high, low, back and forth, back and forth. So that makes them highly stressed, ready to fight when they open the door of the car to respond. Those are the emergency situations. But of course, policemen and firemen are trained that they overcome this internal desire of behavior and modify that behavior so that they're able to deal with the situation as it should be. Why do we talk about sirens and why do we talk about police and responding? We're really talking about how we respond, aren't we? That's what Paul is talking about this morning. Paul makes these personal remarks about the disagreement between two women in that congregation. And what he tells them is to be of the same mind in the Lord. And then what does he do? He goes to the whole congregation. He says, help them work through the differences. Help them work through the pain and the problems that they're having. And then he said, be like the ones of my co-workers. And your name will also be in the book of life. Paul urged them to help those in their congregation that were in peril. So how do we bring this up together for a final thought? We do this in the way that Paul did. He didn't blaze in with the sirens on, the lights flashing. He went in very low key. He didn't spread any gossip. He didn't take sides with either one of the two. He didn't change what was happening by putting code 2 or code 3 with lights and sirens. The church already knew about the conflict, and he urged them to help the two women in times when people are in turmoil. Those of us who are trusted and respected by both sides can kind of assist the individuals in peril to get through the times of those issues. Paul knew that there were people like that in his Philippi congregation. I know there are people like that in our congregation. He urged, I urge, when you see a conflict, reach out in a way that doesn't have code 2 or code 3. It's a code 1, gentle and graceful and peaceful. Paul is calling to the two women, indeed the whole church, which includes us today, to rally around the things of God, to have humility in Christ, and on that common ground, to find a place where even those with seemingly irreconcilable difference can stand together in fellowship. And for those of us who are trying to help those people, take Paul's advice. Code 1, no lights, no siren. And the people say, Amen.